considerations regarding terrorism. And the chair of this panel is Dean Linda Brady, who is the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at North Carolina State University. So Linda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for inviting me to participate in this conference. I am a relative newcomer to the Research Triangle area, but in the 9 months that I've lived here and have been at NC State, I have really been impressed by the extent of collaboration that occurs among universities and related organizations in this area. I think we should be very grateful for the opportunities that we have here that colleagues in other parts of the country do not have to work together on programs like the one we're involved in today and tomorrow. As all of you know, since September 11th, much of the foreign policy and national security community has been focused on the more immediate challenges associated with the war on terrorism. This panel shifts our focus to long-term foreign policy considerations. In other words, on this panel, we would like to take a step back, as it were, to consider how the war against terrorism relates to our broader foreign policy objectives. I know our panelists will deal with a variety of issues, but I would simply like to pose 3 areas in which I think we need to address our concerns. The first question relates to where the war on terrorism fits within the overall framework of American foreign and defense policy. How does the war on terrorism impact other goals and objectives, such as efforts to contain the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and materiel, progress toward a peace settlement in the Middle East, or reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, to take just 3 of many examples. In other words, one of the important questions relates to how what Bruce Jentleson has called the September 10th agenda can be addressed. Second question that I think we need to focus on relates to the ways in which the events of September 11th and since have changed the relationships that exist between the United States and our European allies, between the United States and other great powers such as Russia and China, and between the United States and friends and allies in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, and in South Asia. A third consideration is from the perspective of resources. How will a focus on the war against terrorism impact America's ability to pursue other foreign policy and defense goals, such as homeland defense or a continuing role in enhancing stability in the Balkans? Resources, including the attention of the American public and the attention span of our political leadership, are not unlimited, and choices will obviously have to be made in this regard. We're pleased to welcome 3 panelists this morning who are well qualified to address long-term foreign policy considerations regarding international terrorism from both national and international perspectives. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephen Biddle. Steve is on leave from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and this year is serving as Associate Research Professor of National Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Steve received his PhD in 1992 in public policy from Harvard. Before coming to Chapel Hill in 1998, he served for more than 10 years as a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses in Alexandria, Virginia, where he directed studies for the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff on issues of conventional force structure, long-range defense planning, future warfare, and conventional arms control. Dr. Biddle's teaching and research interests are in the area of international security, U.S. defense policy, and strategic studies. He is a prolific author and has a book manuscript titled Theories of Victory, Explaining Military Capability, under review. He has presented testimony before congressional committees on matters of conventional net assessment and arms control, served as U.S. representative to the NATO Defense Research Group Panel 7 study on stable defense, and is co-director of the Columbia University Summer Workshop on the analysis of military operations and strategy. And last but not least, he reports that his bird-watching life list stands at 515 species. Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Christoph Heusgen. Dr. Heusgen is currently Director of the Policy Unit of the Secretariat General of the Council of the European Union in Brussels. He pursued university studies in economics at St. Gall, Switzerland, and Georgia Southern College, where he held a Rotary Scholarship. He pursued postgraduate studies in Paris, worked with the Deutsche Bank in Paris, and received a doctorate in economics from the University of St. Gall. In 1980, he entered the German Foreign Service. He has served in a number of posts, including Consulate General in Chicago, where he was responsible for press and economic affairs, Deputy Head of the Delegation to COCOM in the Embassy in Paris, and then within the Foreign Office in Bonn, Private Secretary to the Coordinator for German-French Relations, Deputy Head of a special section in charge of negotiations of the Treaty of Maastricht, Deputy Head of the Private Office of Foreign Minister Kinkel in charge of European affairs. So he clearly is well positioned to address the international perspective on this issue. Our final speaker, as you will know from your program, is a substitute for our original representative from the State Department. We are really delighted to have with us Ambassador David Ransom, who served as the American ambassador to Bahrain from 1994 to 1997. He was deeply involved in issues of U.S. commerce and investment, diplomatic coordination of various security policy, political military affairs, and support for the Middle East peace process. During the Gulf War, Ambassador Ransom was in charge of the State Department's Office of Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus in the Bureau of European Affairs, and provided the extensive Washington backstopping for the military and diplomatic efforts mounted out of Turkey against Iraq. Ambassador Ransom is a Middle East area specialist, having served in posts in Tehran, Beirut, and Jeddah. He served as Deputy Chief of Mission in 3 embassies in the Yemen Arab Republic, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Damascus, Syria. Although he is a retired State Department career officer, he also served twice in tours outside of the department, working in the White House on Mr. Kissinger's and later General Scowcroft's National Security Council staff, and also also in the Defense Department, where he served as director of the Near East, South Asia, and Africa Division, serving both Harold Brown and Caspar Weinberger. In addition, he completed a year at the National War College in Washington, and while there, his essay on Gulf security was published and selected out of all the essays of all the senior service schools that year for an award of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In his retirement, Ambassador Ransom created an international consulting firm, DM Ransom Associates, and now works with various investment and other projects in the Gulf region. Please welcome all of our panelists, and we're going to ask Dr. Biddle to begin.
Thanks, Linda. I'm often amazed, actually, at how many panel presentations I've heard without knowing what the speakers' life lists were. And I wanted to start by thanking Scott Silliman and Robinson Everett, since I'm on leave this year up in Carlisle Barracks. It takes a speaking invitation to get me back down to the Triangle. I appreciate all such opportunities. I'm probably going to disappoint the law students in the audience, though, and because I actually plan to say nothing at all about law. I may disappoint everyone else because I'm not going to say that much about the very long-term future of global conflict on terrorism. I'm going to focus primarily on what we might think of as the midterm future. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the strategic and the military aspects of the midterm future of this conflict. Probably the first order requirement of any strategist is to fit means to ends. And it seems to me that the current administration's conduct of the war represents a significant mismatch between ends and means. At the risk of speaking colloquially, I think I'll characterize the administration's current policy as speaking loudly and carrying a small stick. And what I want to do this morning is to lay out the case for why I think this is so and how a better relationship between ends and means might be formulated. I'm going to first start by talking some about the ends in this conflict, our war aims, what we think we're in this for, what we think we're going to accomplish, and I'll then turn to talking in a little bit of detail about the means. So let me start with the ends. And the first point to be made about the ends is that the ends that we're pursuing in this war, as declared, are radically sweeping. In fact, if you can think of a spectrum of plausible war aims in this conflict, from minimalist to maximalist, minimalist meaning round up and arrest any surviving conspirators from the 9/11 event, maximalist is essentially what the administration has declared. A global war of unspecified size and duration against any and all terrorists, with the minor proviso at the end of global reach. Now, from time to time in conversations with friends and colleagues in the policy world, I describe the administration's objectives this way, and I'm typically no polish. That's silly. They don't mean that. It's rhetorical flourish. The real policy is actually much more narrow, and it's actually focused on Al-Qaeda. And I thought, since many of you are probably doing that at the moment, I would augment my comments with a little bit of technology just to bury the point in the ground with a dramatic reading of some statements by the President. Starting on September 20th with his address to the joint session of Congress, our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. On the USS Enterprise on December 7th, our war against terror is not a war against one terror leader or one terror group. Terrorism is a movement, an ideology that respects no boundary of nationality or decency. We will not rest until we stop all terrorists at global reach. On February 16 at Elmendorf Air Force Base, this is about fighting terror wherever it hides. This nation will not rest until we have destroyed terrorism, until we have denied the threat of global terrorism. Is this the President just getting off text from time to time? Is this actually a government policy? Well, in fact it is, and I'm not going to read you all of this text, but just to suggest that I'm not taking the President out of context, a couple of selected formal, on-the-record policy statements by other members of the administration. National National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, our enemy is not just Al-Qaeda, but every terrorist group with global reach. The United States has made clear to leaders on every continent that there is no such thing as a good terrorist and a bad terrorist. You cannot condemn Al-Qaeda and hug Hamas. Paul Wolfowitz talks about a policy of zero tolerance for terrorism. This is a pretty sweeping articulation of what we're about in this war. Now, my friend and colleague Corey Dauber in Communication Studies at UNC tells me, you need to watch out about this simply being rhetorical flourish for purposes that aren't necessarily policy in nature. But if it is just rhetorical flourish, it's rhetorical flourish with some real concrete and important consequences. It's very hard to run a foreign policy using two sets of books. A declaratory policy of global war on terrorism, GWOT in the Defense Department argon. It's not real unless you've got an acronym. This one has an acronym now, so it is definitely real. And then a real hidden policy is something substantially more narrowly framed than that, unless in the process you're going to create a major danger of incoherence across a mass organization the size of even just the Defense Department, much less the Department of State, Justice, INS, Commerce, Treasury, 50 state governments with interests in Homeland Security, and all the other branches of the federal, state, and local government with a major stake and a major role to play in this conflict. In fact, I'm here to tell you this morning, a GWOT has in fact become the policy of the U.S. government. And the executive branch agencies are taking it very seriously and very literally. And it seems to me as a result it's appropriate to evaluate that particular articulation of our ends and the merits thereof. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the pros and cons of articulating our aims in the war this broadly. And I'll start with the pros because there are some important advantages of doing this. It's not an obviously wrong-headed approach. First of all, it permits preemptive action against a much wider range of threats than would be the case if we formulated our war aims as being against, for example, Al-Qaeda in particular. And that wider range of threats includes prominently what some are now calling new terrorists. The argument one often hears in this community is that traditional terrorists killed instrumentally in small numbers for political purposes. They famously wanted few people dying and lots of people watching. The new terrorists, on the other hand, are often asserted to kill for apolitical, religious, ethnic, or millenarian purposes without traditional constraints on mass killing. And in fact, it's often said that for the new terrorists, killing is rapidly becoming an end in itself and not a means to some sort of political agenda. Al-Qaeda is often held to be the archetypical example of a new terrorist organization. But in this point of view, it's certainly not the only one. Many more Al-Qaedas, it's often argued, are waiting in the wings, and the administration's broad articulation of war aims permits preemptive action against that wider set of potential future opponents. Prominently, a broad articulation of war aims also permits action against states like Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, the now infamous axis of evil, which may pose important threats to important U.S. national interests that may or may not have had anything to do with September 11, but are still important and worthy of taking action against. A second major pro of a broad articulation of war aims is that it provides a quid pro quo for allied cooperation. If you join us in our conflict against our particular enemy, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, we will join you against conflicts against terrorists that are of importance to you locally, but perhaps not to us in the United States. The IRA would fall in other possibilities. A third major pro is moral force. It faces up to what President Bush clearly sees as evil incarnate, and it doesn't implicitly condone some evil activity by not including it in our formal statement of what we're after in this war. And finally, and again in a bow to Professor Dauber, it provides domestic political clarity, which is important in motivating a war effort across a large society with diverse interests. There are some downsides to this kind of broad articulation of our aims, and I'm just going to touch on 5 this morning. The first of these is that it mistakes a tactic for an enemy. Waging a war on terrorism is a lot like waging a war on strategic bombing or a war on alliance making. It pits us against a tactic or a technique, not an opponent. And those who use this tactic include a wide variety of parties who threaten no vital American national interest. As long as there are aggrieved parties in the world too weak to wage conventional wars, there will be terrorism, and we surely can't hope to remove grievance from the world. We can, however, defeat specific political programs and the armed movements they inspire. We did that with fascism, we did that with communism, and we can surely do it with bin Ladenism. Second con of a broad articulation of war aims: it creates unnecessary enemies for ourselves. Hamas, Hezbollah, the FARC, the IRA may not have had casus belli against the United States before September 11, but to the extent that we lump them all together with Al-Qaeda and announce that they're next, as soon as we get Al-Qaeda out of the way, we give them every incentive in the world to make common cause with Al-Qaeda and become mortal enemies of the United States. We make allies out of Saddam and Osama, Hamas and the FARC. A central function of good grand strategy is to secure allies for oneself and deny them to one's opponents, and a common grand strategic failing of defeated major powers has been their failure to do this. Think, for example, of the world in 1917. The United States, Britain, and France shared many important cultural bonds and strategic interests with one another, but our interests also diverged in important ways, with the net result that the United States remained on the sidelines in the war against Germany. A central grand strategic mission for Germany should thus have been to drive the United States apart from the Entente, or at a minimum avoid doing anything to gratuitously drive us together. Yet the German U-boat campaign did exactly that. It took a power that might otherwise have remained neutral and gave it a powerful common cause with Germany's existing enemies, in the process creating a hostile alliance that was much too strong for Germany to defeat. In 1941, again, the U.S. has many close cultural and other connections with Britain, yet again the U.S. is on the sidelines in a war against Germany. Even after Pearl Harbor, FDR would have faced difficult domestic political problems in bringing the United States into a global war against the Axis generally, as opposed to simply Japan. And an adroit German grand strategy might at least have avoided making this problem any easier for FDR to solve. Yet Hitler simply lumps the US and the UK together by declaring war on us as well as the Brits. And it seems to me that today we're doing something very similar by focusing only on the commonalities and the apparent connections between terrorist organizations, rather than focusing on the differences of interest among them and trying to exploit these for our own strategic ends. We could be trying to highlight those differences of interest to drive our potential enemies apart from one another, rather than driving them together by treating potentially very heterogeneous groups as functionally equivalent. Third major con with a very broad articulation of war aims: it misses the real threat. Terrorism per se is not an existential threat to the United States. In 1996, terrorism killed 24 Americans. Most world terrorist organizations killed very few Americans. Even the most lethal ones, like Hamas, Hezbollah, the IRA, or the Tamil Tigers, have never seen it in the past as being in their political interest to target Americans per se. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, is different. But they're different because their political interests are different from these other organizations. And to date, Al-Qaeda's political interests are very unusual as opposed to terrorists at large. The real distinction between terrorists we should care about and those that we shouldn't isn't whether or not they have global reach, whatever that means. In a globalized world, any group with an airline ticket or an internet service provider has global reach. The real issue is the intent to mass murder Americans. And this intent is now largely unique to Al-Qaeda. Halting Al-Qaeda, even if other terrorist violence continued at today's levels, would reduce the threat to Americans from tens to hundreds of thousands of potential fatalities back to something on the order of dozens to hundreds, which is a level that we lived with for decades. Now, it's sometimes argued, though, that the nature of terrorism itself is changing. That a broad wave of the new terrorists that I alluded to earlier are bringing an ominous increase in terrorist lethality that will come to make terrorism a central rather than a peripheral threat to America in the future. And to elaborate somewhat and assess that case, I'm just going to show you and keep the law students in shape by moving them back and forth as often as I can. A graphic drawn from the State Department. Okay, now I don't have to yell. A graphic drawn from the State Department's terrorist incident data set indicating the average lethality of terrorist incidents in terms of the number of people killed per incident recorded over a time period stretching from 1991 to about 2000. And what you see in this representation, which is a commonly represented empirical argument in the debate on terrorism at the moment, is what appears to be a broad-based secular increase in the lethality of terrorist actions in the world. The number of incidents has been going down, but the lethality on average of the terrorist incidents conducted has been going up. Many people look at this trend and suggest, aha, this is new terrorism on the march. The future lies in a broad wave of radically more lethal terrorist organizations, not the old days of Black September and others. Where I'm going to stand. In reality, though, mass casualty terrorism is still a very narrowly distributed phenomenon. It's restricted to a handful of groups, only one of which, Al-Qaeda, has ever deliberately targeted Americans for mass violence. And in fact, the upward trend in this data itself is attributable entirely to Al-Qaeda. Keep the law students on their toes. I'm going to revisit these data, removing only attacks by Al-Qaeda and its predecessors within this interval. And if I do that, I see a very different outcome. And note a couple of important differences in this chart. First of all, a difference in scale. The most lethal incident on the previous chart, terrorism including Al-Qaeda, was in the vicinity, or created a year in which, on average, about 30 people were killed per terrorist incident involved. The most lethal year in this data set without Al-Qaeda is less than a tenth, or is about a tenth as lethal. Secondly, instead of a secular, broad-based, progressive increase in the lethality of terrorism over time, what we actually see after 1994 is a statistically significant decline in the lethality of global terrorism over time. Well, maybe more is coming in the future. Some say this whole phenomenon of mass casualty terrorism is just so new that its very novelty in itself is important as a harbinger of things to come. But in fact, mass casualty terrorism isn't new. It's been around for decades at least. In fact, no contemporary terrorist organization has yet equaled the Algerian FLN, which murdered over 7,300 civilians between 1954 and 1956. Mass casualty terror has never been either a broad-based or a widespread phenomenon, but it isn't now either. At any given time, a handful of terrorist groups have seen major violence as advantageous, but most have not. And the data show no clear departure from this norm today. And this implies that the real enemy is Al-Qaeda, and the ideology of bin Ladenism that fuels it and its lethality, not terrorism in general. Fourth significant downside to a broad articulation of war aims, it spreads our forces very thinly. We already have troops engaged in this war, either as combatants or advisors in Afghanistan, the Philippines, Yemen, soon to be Georgia. We could easily have troops in possibly major shooting wars in Iraq, Somalia, Colombia, Israel, and Palestine. Terrorism as such is a very widespread phenomenon. If we pursue terrorism as such, as widely as the president apparently intends, this could eventually put major demands on American troop strength, especially if we find ourselves in multiple wars with major state sponsors of terrorism like Iraq or Iran. The final downside that I'm going to point to of a broad articulation of war aims is that it makes final victory improbable. We can manage the threat of terrorism as a chronic but probably permanent condition, but we can't ever really defeat it. A war on terrorism, as others mentioned earlier this morning, is necessarily much more like the war on drugs or the war on poverty than it is like World War II, or even the 1991 Persian Gulf War, or even the Cold War. Even in the Cold War, one could devise a strategy, containment, with a real prospect of eventually defeating our main opponent. But it's very hard to see how a war on terrorism could ever really achieve this level of finality. Now with that, let me move to the means. And my broad characterization of the means that the administration has adopted in this war is that they're really quite modest. They've asked very, very few sacrifices of the American people in order to wage this conflict. The administration describes this as a war for our very way of life, if not our national survival per se, and I'm inclined to agree with them. And in fact, President Bush often compares the global war on terrorism to World War II. Yet in World War II, the nation accepted massive sacrifices to wage a total war effort, including a draft to mobilize a 15 million man military, rationing of food and fuel on the home front, scrap drives, restrictions on civilian use of commodities like rubber or metal, restrictions on strikes or labor actions, and of course, 292,000 dead and 570,000 wounded Americans. By contrast, the conduct of the global war on terrorism to date has demanded far less of Americans. The administration's war policy, for example, has been characterized by a heavy reliance on foreign proxies to do the heavy lifting, both tactically and strategically. Tactically, we let our Afghan allies do the heavy ground fighting, but strategically, we try to coerce states who harbor terrorism to root out the terrorist cells and infrastructure themselves, rather than having us do it directly. To date, our policy has shown little or no willingness to commit U.S. troops to peacekeeping or nation building. It's displayed extreme casualty sensitivity, and in line with what Bruce Jennelson suggested this morning, the issue here is the administration's casualty sensitivity, not the public's, and not really the military rank and files either. Our policy has displayed a very limited financial commitment to post-war reconstruction, foreign aid, or economic assistance, no tax increase to fund the war, no energy conservation initiatives to reduce dependence on Mideast oil, no real restrictions on border traffic or port operations, which might interfere with trade and commerce, but could make our borders potentially more secure. No major or across-the-board reserve call-ups or sweeping stop-loss orders for the military. In fact, most policies that could be called anything close to real sacrifice are either for things that the administration wanted anyway, even before September 11, like, for example, a defense budget increase. They campaigned on the basis of this. Or opening the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling, or civil liberties restrictions and expanded prosecutorial authority to deal with suspected terrorists. Others, though much discussed, are far from major hardships on most Americans, for example, longer waits at airport security lines. There are some focused hardships on particular groups, but the conduct of the global war on terrorism to date is a far, far cry from World War II or even the 1991 Gulf War. Advantages and disadvantages of a more modest approach to waging the conflict. There are, again, some major advantages. It reduces the cost of the war, both financially, militarily, and politically, to a point where you could potentially sustain it for a very long time, perhaps even indefinitely. It reduces the danger of ensnaring us in nationalist guerrilla wars in places like Afghanistan by making it harder for the local populations to see us as a conquering power. And it's obviously preferable to fight a war at low cost than at high cost, and especially so when the cost is measured in American lives. But there is a major disadvantage, and that disadvantage is reduced mission effectiveness. A restricted U.S. footprint in theaters like Afghanistan, for example, leaves us without enough troops to prevent al-Qaeda operatives from escaping, regrouping, and fleeing the country. Our limited economic and military contribution to rebuilding Afghanistan is risking allowing the country to descend into the same chaos that made it an attractive home base for al-Qaeda in the first place. Our proxies, perhaps most important of all, don't share our interests and don't pursue the war in the way that we would prefer. Now, the problems of relying on proxies in Afghanistan have already been widely publicized. The local warlords didn't share our interests in capturing Mullah Omar or Osama bin Laden, and as a result, the quarry escaped to Tora Bora and elsewhere. But in fact, this problem is actually much more fundamental and substantially broader in nature than just Afghanistan. as alliance theory and principal agent theory would lead at least the political scientists among us to expect, no ally is ever going to share our interests completely. And divergent interests are going to lead to strategic behavior from our allied agents that will create potentially serious problems for we principals. We believe, for example, that compellant threats can get states like Yemen to shut down the terrorist groups within their borders. The Yemenis obviously don't share our interests in this. Rather than waging an aggressive war of extermination against al-Qaeda as we would do, they're much more likely to seek out the minimum response needed to get the U.S. off their backs. Combined with maximum covert assistance to al-Qaeda operatives within their borders to enable them to ride out the campaign as safely as possible. Our inability to monitor Yemeni compliance with our wishes enables them to do an awful lot of shirking. We depend, after all, on the Yemenis themselves for most of our information on terrorist activities and counter-terrorist conduct within their borders. If our intelligence on terrorist activity in Yemen were any good, we'd solve the problem ourselves rather than relying on them to do it for us. So we know mostly what they tell us, and probably not a whole lot more. This combination of the opacity inherent in terrorists as targets, which means inherently limited monitoring of what our proxies are doing, together with a major divergence in interests between we principals and our allied agents, is likely to make the administration's strategy of reliance on proxies very problematic as a general matter. Now, what does all this imply then? Well, it seems to me that it implies that there's a strong case to be made for scaling back the ends, but ramping up the means as we conduct this conflict. Our real enemy is not terrorism per se, it's al-Qaeda, and especially al-Qaeda's political program of radically separatist jihad. By restricting our war aims to the real threat, we focus on the real danger to Americans, we avoid making needless enemies, we concentrate our resources, and we create a winnable war against a tangible opponent, rather than a chronic struggle against a tactic and whoever adopts it, whatever their politics or ambitions. But this is not a call for scaling back our efforts. On the contrary, it seems to me that the gravity of the stakes here warrant a substantially more vigorous war effort than the administration has so far chosen to mount. One including both a more serious, sustained commitment to post-war reconstruction in Afghanistan and a more muscular effort at political and economic liberalization in the Arab Middle East, as well as a commitment of sufficient American military forces to any theater where we do engage to destroy the al-Qaeda elements we came to fight, rather than allowing them to melt into the hills to conduct sustained guerrilla campaigns against overstretched American bases and under-resourced indigenous allies. And with that, I'll stop with the disclaimer that I should have started with. Everything I just said is the opinion strictly of myself, not of the U.S. Army, not of the Department of Defense, not of the U.S. government, and quite possibly not of anybody at all other than me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank very much you, Scott, for inviting me to come to Duke University. I also would like to thank Sharon Peters from the Duke Center for European Studies, who has been, I think, instrumental on getting me on the speakers list and giving me the opportunity to come back to Duke University, to this very fine university and this fantastic campus. I would also perhaps make one little remark, Linda, on the presentation, on my biography and my present position. For Europeans, average Europeans, it's usually very difficult to understand what we are doing in Brussels and who belongs to the Commission, to the Council, to the Parliament. I can imagine that for you here in the US it's even more difficult. So simply my present position is the head of the political staff of Javier Solana, former NATO Secretary General, who is now the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. And I'm very thankful for the organizers to give me a chance to address you and to give you a European perspective. 11th of September, of course, primarily in the US was affected, but I think this is, and you'll all agree with me, it's of course a very take steps. The European Union took a number of rather immediate specific measures in the fight against terrorism, of which I mentioned a few, and then in more general terms, the September 11th served also as an incentive, as an additional incentive, kind of a wake-up call for the European Union to step up its efforts to really create a European common foreign and security policy. First, let me present briefly the more immediate steps that the European Union took and the immediate consequences that the EU drew after September 11th. What became clear to everybody is that terrorism and terrorists cannot be fought on national level. Individual countries are not able to cope with the challenges that are posed by themselves. Quite to the contrary, terrorists actually, and this holds true for all international organized crime, terrorists play with the fragmentation of competences, with they profit from the insistence on national sovereignty, and they also profit of the reluctance of international actors, international states, sovereign states, to share information across borders. So September 11 made it very clear that the EU member states had to overcome this thinking, and the thinking which is limited to national boundaries. Of course, and some of you have already mentioned that, terrorism and terrorist threat is nothing new for the European Union. We have in a number of member states during the last decades, we have been threatened and affected by terrorists. Only to recall to you the most important ones we have, and we continue to have, the ETA in Spain. We have in the IRA in Ireland. We have the Red Army fraction in Germany. We have the Red Brigades in Italy. We have the separatists, the terrorist separatists in Kos, and in other countries we have similar problems. But nevertheless, the dimension of September 11th, of course, were such that it really changed the parameters. So I don't want to go into detail, but I think it's interesting to demonstrate some of the steps that were actually taken to immediately fight terrorism and to have more means at the disposal of the European Union to cope with the threats. First of all, we had the creation of a European arrest warrant, which makes it much easier now to actually prosecute terrorists, and you don't have to go to the very difficult steps of extradition procedures. We have a common definition of terrorist crimes, which again simplifies prosecution. We have a common list of terrorist organizations and specific terrorists. We have an enhanced cooperation of between special services, basically intelligence services, facilitation of trans-border freezing of assets, cooperation regarding the threat of biological and chemical weapons, creation of a European Civil Protection Agency, common position on the regulation of aviation security. All these efforts are, of course, first of all, internal European efforts, but the logic of the fight against terrorism, the logic of the 11th September also was that the European Union has to seek cooperation outside its own borders, and in particular with the United States. And in this respect, I think the cooperation after 11th September between the specialized services, between all institutions involved, were very excellent. So these were some of the measures that have been taken with more immediate effect after September 11th. And when you know the European Union, when you know its sometimes slow and difficult decision-making process, it's really be able to exert more influence in the world, in world politics, to have a word to say in crisis caused by terrorism or having other origins, in general to defend its interests. The EU had to, as I said, come to this common foreign security policy, which means the EU has to speak with one voice, has to build up and strengthen the means at its disposal to be active in crisis management. This means both military means and this means civilian means. And the European Union continues to install and establish the institutional framework necessary to actually be effective in crisis management. This enterprise is very difficult for the EU to find the right balance, between, on the one hand, joint effort of all 15 countries, where we try to really bundle up the potential of 350 million people, the potential, also the economic potential of its 15 and soon 25 member states. And on the other side, of course, and this is very dear to the heart of every European, to preserve the national identity, to preserve also foreign policy of individual member states, which have countries like France and Great Britain, of course, and all the others, their own history and their own perspective. Now, an additional reason for the European Union to go ahead and step up its efforts to create this common foreign security policy was, and I think I can say this very frankly, was also U.S. politics. And even before September 11, Bush administration made clear that it intended to lower some of its engagement. I think one of the speakers, I think it was Bruce Wilson, mentioned it, that in the perspective of the Bush administration, there was this kind of type A, type B, type C crisis, and with the intention to concentrate on the most important ones, which meant, for instance, lowering of engagement in the Balkans. So also, with regard to that goal of the U.S. administration, we thought we have to fill this gap. Unfortunately, I would say that this is not only true for the Balkans, but also for the Middle East, where I think at least at the beginning, at the outset of the Bush administration, perhaps under the impression also of Camp David and what President Clinton tried to achieve, there was no longer a proactive policy with regard to the Middle East. Both Balkans and the Middle East are, of course, areas which are much closer to the European Union than they are to the US, and therefore the stability in these regions are of a strong interest to the EU. Therefore, again, the EU and member states really realized after September 11 in particular that they really have to get their act together. The EU in practice has, during the last years, already achieved a lot in order to be effective as European Union in crisis management. We have the institutional framework. I don't want to go into detail, but we now have in the European Union our own military staff. We have a military committee. We have a body that meets twice per week, political and security committee, to deal with crisis management. We have an intelligence cell, intelligence corporation. We are building capabilities. We set so-called headline goals, both for military and for civilian instruments of crisis management, where we set certain goals, for instance, 60,000 European troops to be available for crisis management by the year 2003, 5,000 policemen to be ready to engage in crisis management and other elements. And then also we try to, what I said before, it's very important for also our partners, we try to enhance the development towards having only one voice with which we want to speak to the outside. This is basically in common foreign security policy, the High Representative for Common Foreign Security Policy, Javier Solana. Of course, I admit that still today we are in a situation where we don't only have one voice. We have, of course, besides the High Representative, we have the rotating presidency, we have the Commission is speaking, and of course we have member states. But when we are criticized for this number of different speakers, I always say that, well, look across the ocean. I mean, when you look at the United States, you have the president, you have the vice president, you have the state secretary, you have the secretary of defense, you have the security advisor, and I think you're all aware of occasions perhaps where not everybody spoke with the same voice. So therefore, I think we don't have to, we must not hide with our achievements, but I admit, of course, that we still have some way to go until we are clearly identified with one voice. When you look into actually now in practice into international crises, I think one can also say that what we are building up in Brussels, what we are establishing, has already had some positive consequences in foreign policy in our daily life. I mentioned the Balkans. I mentioned the fact that the U.S. administration made it clear that it wants gradually to get out of the Balkans, and I think that the European Union has, in practice, proved that it is able to fill the gap. I don't know how much you have followed the crises that developed last year, for instance, in Macedonia, where thanks to conflict prevention taken up by the High Representative Javier Solana, was supported by all member states, was able to defuse that crisis. We have been actually in Macedonia being very active in actually consolidating a government. We have been active in forcing the so-called Ohrid agreement, where the ethnic Albanians and ethnic Macedonians came together to decide on constitutional changes for their country. We have sent a number of EU monitors into the country, and we have been with the European Commission very active in giving economic aid to that country, so that today, after some very worrying developments a year ago, we can say that Macedonia is stabilized. In just the last weeks, Javier Solana almost single-handedly was able to defuse another problem, another crisis which was developing, and that was the crisis on Serbia and Montenegro. I don't know how much you have followed that. One of the problems of conflict prevention always is that conflict prevention is successful when you don't read anything about a crisis, so you don't get credit for successful conflict prevention. But what Javier Solana was able to do is to diffuse this rising tension between Serbia and Montenegro, where Montenegro wanted to become independent, have an independent state, create big problems then also for what is going to happen with Kosovo, that Javier Solana was able to broker it. There was a month ago to broker an agreement between Serbia and Montenegro, where they have now agreed, at least for the next 3 years, to try to work together on a federal state. So I think that with regard to the Balkans, the European Union has proved that it's not only words, but it's also and already action that it is showing. On the Middle East, and I'm sure Ambassador, you will talk about the Middle East. The European Union has also been trying to somehow fill the gap that was left open by the reluctance of the Bush administration to for understandable reasons, to engage in crisis management. But again, and I think we have made some impact. Javier Solana, for instance, was a member of the so-called Mitchell Committee, and he has written the European part of the so-called Mitchell Report, which for a long time was the basis for what we still hope to be a Middle East peace process. But what we have always said on the Middle East, this also holds true for the Balkans. This holds true for some activities we had in North Korea, which you mentioned in the introduction, is that the European Union does not want to be seen as a competitor to the United States. What the European Union wants to be seen is to be an actor that is complementary to the second long-term effects that we see from the European perspective after the 11th September, and that is the implication for the EU, and there we perhaps differ from the US, that we have to step up our efforts in international and multilateral cooperation. While the US, and this is really a little bit polemical, perhaps a little bit simplistic, is rather engaged in a unilateral globalism, we believe, and the EU is an advocate in multilateral globalism. The problems we are facing today, terrorism is only one of these. Fight against poverty, fight against environmental damage. These problems cannot cope with unilaterally, but they have to be approached multilaterally. The Afghanistan campaign, which was carried out unilaterally by the US, in my view, is rather the exception. And when we now look at the long-term stabilization of Afghanistan, which is actually absolutely necessary, because otherwise we'll have, in a few years, Al-Qaeda all revisited, we need a multilateral, a multinational effort. And the European Union has been very much engaged in giving economic aid, but also the member states of the European Union today are among the 13 European countries, are among the 17 countries that today represent ISAF, the stabilization force stationed in Kabul. And as I said, we think that we have to have a multilateral approach for the long-term stabilization of Afghanistan, and this holds true for other areas as well. Of course, multilateralism is a difficult process, a very painful process. You need to find compromises. You have to be satisfied with these compromises. You never get the first best solution, but you get the second best, or sometimes only a third best solution. But it's still better than not to address a problem at all. And I think it's much better to try to involve the international community and to try to involve these countries you're concerned about, and we are all concerned about, in these difficult compromises. We believe in the European Union, we believe in the International Criminal Court. We are just crossing, maybe today, the benchmark of 60 ratifications so that the ICC can take up its work in a couple of months. And for an EU citizen, it's not comprehensible that the US is not a partner in an undertaking where you actually try to have general principle or a basis for suing terrorists, where you have a basis where you can actually bring to court leaders of so-called rogue states and have them face their responsible in the international court. We believe that the international regime to control weapons of mass destruction have to be strengthened. There are a number of conventions, a number of efforts where we think that the US should be part of: the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, NPT, the Ottawa Convention, the Test Ban Treaty. All that, I think, are efforts worthwhile to get engaged. Let me close by summarizing what I think is valid for the EU, holds true for the US as well. To cope with the number of challenges that we are facing, isolationism is not the answer. We cannot isolate ourselves from the world outside. Unilateralism is also a very short-sighted policy. No country, not even the US, will be able to solve problems that we are facing, and they are all interrelated to solve these problems by themselves. Multilateralism, in my view, is needed. Even if it's painful, it's the only mechanism that will bring us worldwide stability, wealth, rule of law, and respect for human rights. Thank you very much.
served 30 years in the Foreign Service as a diplomat, taking the king's shilling without gaining some respect and sympathy for the king. And I find myself today somewhat in that situation, as you will see in the remarks I make. It's not hard to talk about American foreign policy in the perspective of the Middle East because all of the crucial debates of 21st century American foreign policy are presented painfully and starkly in our dilemmas in the Middle East. You've heard a lot about many of them this morning, whether to go it alone or go with others, to pursue a narrow nationalism or enlightened self-interest, to practice military coercion or diplomatic cooperation, to be guided by cold-blooded realism or idealistic humanism. There is a debate raging in this country today on all of these issues. It's a good issue. It's a good debate. But I think that the Middle East captures most of these issues, as I say, very starkly and painfully. Let's take a look at some of those issues. September the 11th excited two quite different responses. One was to get the Al-Qaeda and its Taliban protectors. The other was much more far-reaching, to prevent any recurrence of asymmetric warfare with weapons of mass destruction on the American homeland. The latter is the nightmare scenario, and it has replaced, especially in the view of some conservatives, the nuclear threat of Cold War years. This doctrine of counterterrorism is, among other things, a simplifying concept, an energizing concept, a political party-building concept. It can be used to trump dozens of competing interests, many with strong congressional and private advocacy. These competing interests made America seem at one point uncertain, limited, inconsistent, especially in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which had been for years another simplifying and dominating concept. Now, it's a cliche that Mr. Bush did not want to engage in foreign policy at the beginning of his term. Most presidents don't. Mr. Bush was adverse to foreign policy anywhere in the world, but particularly in the Middle East. He wanted to do domestic policy instead, taxes, budgets, education, social security, and so on. But he was driven to the foreign policy in the Middle East after 9/11, not just because he had to take on the Al-Qaeda, a group which had Arab leadership and funding, but because of the threat which Iraq seemed to present due to its real or imagined development of weapons of mass destruction. He hoped he could do this, carry out this Iraqi agenda, with Arab support and without getting caught in the coils of the Arab-Israeli struggle. Like all foreign policy decisions, this decision is not entirely based on terms as a calculation of foreign interests. It has a domestic calculation behind it as well. As an effort not to engage in the messy peacemaking of the Arab-Israeli struggle, but instead to mount a campaign to crush the Saddam regime, this effort offered a chance to win firm domestic political support from the American Friends of Israel and from Israel's present Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon. Sharon saw no reason to settle with the Arabs, especially if it meant giving up settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, and he also saw, even more than his friends in the U.S., a mortal threat to his own country from Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The stakes are high in the Middle East, and Sharon is no one to quibble about that. George Bush, like every other American president before him, didn't want to take on the Israeli lobby. His father's efforts in opposing Israeli settlements contributed heavily, he thought, to the election of Bill Clinton. The challenge was especially daunting because Mr. Bush said he had no dependable Arab partner. And this is a crucial fact in politics in the United States that I want to underline for the attention of each of you. advice was that you had to distrust and not esteem the Yasser of Arafat. As George Bush told many Arab leaders, he didn't think that either Sharon or Arafat wanted to make peace. They wanted to fight. They wanted more from the other, and they thought the fighting would help them get it. Mr. Bush simply wasn't going to get in the middle of a fruitless Arab effort. And that is the line he used again and again with Mubarak and Hamid and Abdallah, a number of Abdallahs in fact. Americans who were energized by counterterrorism as a concept told Mr. Bush he didn't need allies against Saddam. Rather, with just a little help from Turkey and Kuwait and a huge application of American air power, working with small local forces, he could do it himself, alone, unilaterally. And that's what I think was the operative idea, briefly, in this administration. Mr. Bush was told that others in the area, faced with American power, Arab states, Iran and others, would acquiesce, and outside powers, Russia, China, the EU, etc., were likewise too weak to oppose America. They would also acquiesce. America was simply too important for them in too many other ways to allow regional or outside powers to oppose us. Finally, Mr. Bush was told that ex post facto, we could justify our campaign against Iraq by saying it was not just in narrow U.S. interests, but in the broad interest of all civilized states, those pagan virtues that Mr. Kaplan mentioned. A simplifying concept has advantages. It's simple. But the problems of a simplifying concept, like counterterrorism, is that the world is not a simple place. It became slowly clear to the Bush administration that the problem of the Arab-Israeli struggle was not just the complication and threats it posed to our Iraq policy, and they were considerable, but the threat and complication it posed to, one, moderate Arab regimes and regional stability, two, to a wider war, three, to oil production and prices, and four, to something I might call the idealistic sense of right and wrong around the world. Let's take these issues one by one. First, Iraq. Arab regimes refused to support a war in Iraq when there was a war in Palestine. No go, we won't do it. Indeed, Iraq policy has been thrown back now to the UN, where the Russians may or may not agree with us in continuing a policy of sanctions, which routes all Iraqi oil sales through the UN and limits Iraq's ability to buy weapons. Regardless on how this vote on sanctions comes out, either continuing the present large Iraqi sales or taking off all the limits on Iraqi oil sales, Saddam Hussein will not be overthrown. He will probably restore a more or less normal diplomatic role in the region, and he will certainly gain the freedom and time to pursue weapons of mass destruction. Second, regional stability. Arab anger in the street is rising. Demonstrations, which Arab governments are firing on to quell, have occurred in Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Bahrain, and Lebanon. The Arab governments in these countries are being blamed for firing on their own citizens rather than halting Israeli carnage. We're being blamed for giving the green light to that carnage. In this situation, our military access, our commercial access, our intelligence cooperation, and our diplomatic leverage are all threatened, along with our Arab friends. Third, the prospect of a wider war looms up. Attacks on Israel from Lebanon and Israeli counterattacks could both escalate. And if there is an engagement with Syrian troops, there is another prospect of escalation. And we should remember that Syria has missiles with chemical warheads. Fourth, oil. Oil is our other vital national interest in the Middle East after Israel. Oil has been overpriced for months due to insecurity of the region, but is now rising even higher in price. It could hit $30 a barrel this month, even though markets are not tight. Oil, along with cheap mortgage money in the 2002 elections to help the Republicans mightily, and enough to drag Europe and Japan out of their recessions. Oil at $30 a barrel, however, would be like a sharp and sudden tax increase, a $50 billion jolt to our economy. Fifth and finally, there's the problem of fairness, real or perceived. Now, I'm an Arabist. I've spent 30 years in the Arab offices and gatherings, arguing for Israel's right to security, prosperity, and normal relationships with its neighbors. I'm a true believer. I have the scars to show for it. So I take second place to no one in this issue. I was on VOA Arabic this week arguing forcefully that Arabs must denounce the suicide bombers and give up the intifada for a ceasefire. But Mr. Sharon has alienated every government in the world by a policy of not just counter-terrorism, but brutal reoccupation that aims at the destruction of the Palestinian Authority. Because Mr. Sharon aims to undo Madrid, Oslo, Camp David, and Taba, all in the name of counterterrorism, Israel now has no friends but us. We have a Prime Minister of Turkey talking about genocide on the part of the Israelis. The German government has cut off arms sales to Israel, and the EU Parliament has voted this last day or so by a tally of, I think, 269 to 202 or something, to remove Israeli preference that is now given to Israeli tariffs, to Israeli exports to Europe, to the EU. That's 27% of Israel's exports. So let me try to draw some conclusions about American foreign policy in the perspective of the Middle East after September the 11th. First, the world really hasn't changed that much. It's still a complicated place, not a simple place. And counterterrorism is not only problem, it may not even be the greatest problem we face. Peacemaking, access to oil, regional stability, a sense of justice must all be taken into account. Second, America still needs coalition. We can't go it alone, no matter how strong we are. Colin Powell has it right. He started in Morocco, meeting there with the Saudi Crown Prince and the Moroccan King. Then he went to Madrid to rally the EU, the UN, NATO, and Russia. Next he goes to Jordan. Then, carrying backing from some of all of these, he takes on Sharon and Arafat. And I might point out in passing that in the light of this diplomatic effort of building coalition, Mr. Netanyahu showed up in Washington yesterday talking to a lot of members of the Senate and the House about why the administration's policy was wrong. He's trying to build coalitions too. Third, America still has a vital role to play, but it's not the one that divides the world neatly into people who are evil and people who are good. Instead, it means dealing with some pretty unsavory characters like Sharon and Arafat. It means swallowing the lumpy fact that diplomacy works when one side does not win everything. Indeed, it works only when each side gets enough to make the outcome defensible. Fourth, we can't make terrorism stop. You might point out that since the invasion of Afghanistan, what turned out to be a brilliant military maneuver by the Americans, totally unexpected by the Central Command at the outset, there have been no Al-Qaeda attacks. I don't know what Richard Reed was about, but we have had silence despite these thousands of alleged sleeper succeeded. And one day, the Syrians rounded up al-Nidal, shipped them off to Libya, and they were never able to mount another operation again. When you lack a base with communications, medical treatment, logistic support, finance, communications, inspiration, indoctrination, tactical planning, when you lack all of these things, you can't work as a terrorist. The World Trade Center attack took months to plan and carry out. It wasn't just sleeper cells who were responsible. It was a huge effort. That's now impossible. Nevertheless, I still think that we can't make terrorism stop. We can be broadly successful, but that's not the only test of policy. In fact, since terrorism is intended to stop diplomacy, terrorism may increase. However, over time, good diplomatic agreements work. I don't want to deprecate the efforts of our military side of our diplomacy. Diplomacy is what comes in and cleans up the mess and makes a livable world. I would point out to everyone who is concerned about the Middle East and Arabs and Israelis living with each other, the Germans have found a way to live with French, Koreans with Japanese, Vietnamese with Americans. It can work in the Middle East as well. Arabs are not monsters, and neither are Israelis. They both want to live in peace. They both want prosperity, not war. This brings me to my fifth and last point. The diplomatic endgame is, believe it or not, in sight. Camp David and Taba took us a long way toward a solution. Mr. Bush and the UN have called for a Palestinian state, the end of occupation, and the end of settlements. The Arabs have approved unanimously at the Arab League, a place that almost always gets things wrong, a peace plan which will accept Israel as a normal state. This is all revolutionary and very heartening, and in that we must keep working to turn this vision into reality. It's possible, and it's desirable, and I think that that is what the Bush administration is now trying to do. Thank you very much.
I know that we do have about 20 minutes, I believe, for questions before we break for lunch. May I ask you, please, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please stand, and we will pass the handheld microphone to you, and please identify yourself and then pose a question to one of our panelists. Yes, sir.
I'm Steve Dynkus from Vermont Law School. This is a question for all the panelists, but especially for Dr. Biddle. You argued strongly that the United States should be focusing its efforts on al-Qaeda rather than waging a war on terrorism generally. And I wonder what we know about al-Qaeda to suggest that it won't react like the Ladner schmooze and simply change itself into something else, divide and disperse, and remain just as great a threat in a different form. Shouldn't we instead be attacking not just al-Qaeda, but all of the roots and sources of terrorism generally? I mean, economic, political, cultural, as well as military.
Maybe I'll lead. I think there are two dimensions to the question. I'll address them in sequence. One is, what if al-Qaeda goes to ground by morphing into a different organization, dispersing, making it harder for us to track their identity? And I think think that's a central problem. That's a central problem, in fact, however we declare our war aims. When we're fighting a war against an organization whose chosen tactics are terrorist and are covert, the business of finding out who is and who isn't Al-Qaeda is at the forefront. And for that matter, that problem doesn't escape us even if we declare a war on terrorism at large. The problem of determining who's a terrorist and who isn't is equally difficult. So I think at the end of the day, no matter how we articulate our war aims, we're stuck with the very, very hard intelligence and police work and military problem of figuring out who the they is, whether our they of interest is all terrorists or Al-Qaeda. As far as the root causes are concerned, I'm absolutely with you with respect to the root causes of bin Ladenism. The root causes of terrorism at large are another matter. But I think in order to have a successful resolution of our conflict with Osama bin Laden and his followers, it's absolutely central that we deal with the wellspring of this movement. I defer to those who know much more about the Mideast than I do, but I would be inclined to argue that the ultimate wellspring in this case is political. Radical disaffection on the part of Islamists in the region with their own governments. There are economic issues involved. They're important. I think a solution will require coming to grips with them. But as Bruce Jellison suggested this morning, the economic and the political in this region, in this conflict, are very tightly intertwined. I'm inclined to think that the initial focus has to be political. Unless we resolve the political problems that are creating Islamist unrest in the region, throwing money at the problem with the Marshall Plan for the Mideast will be money not well spent.
I may add, in addition to what you just said, one thought, and that is, of course, we have to fight militarily, we have to fight the identified terrorists that are not caught, etc. But we have to look at the root causes. And what we have to do is, when we talk about Marshall Plan and throw in money, we have to aim very carefully at what we do. To give you an example, the European Union has been trying to set up the Palestinian Authority and spending money on that. And we have tried to control what they, where they spend the money on. Of course, it's very difficult. The Palestinian Authority is not the U.S. administration or the administration of a European country. So we have tried, although personnel-wise, the Commission has not that many people at its disposal, but we have tried to do something. But then we found out that some of the money that we're spending that went to the Cultural Ministry, and they had their school books being written, published with European money, and then we detected that there's openly hatred against Israelis is taught in these books. So we have to be, when we spend money on economic reform, on cultural, I think we have to be very careful and look very closely at what we are funding, and then trying to engage in that. We have to engage in cultural dialogue. We have to see to it that those fundamental Islamic schools where the jobless kids and youngsters are being educated, that these schools don't discontinue to do what they are doing. And so this is a very complicated long-term engagement that we have to get into it, and military measures alone will not solve those problems.
Any other questions? Question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Walter Cox, teacher at Duke Law School. Does the, I guess this is for Dr. Heusgen, I might be mispronouncing your name, so I apologize. Does the advent of the euro dollar add a new dimension to the financing of terrorist activities? Does it give them a new opportunity for money laundering and so forth? Sale of diamonds or drugs or whatever they use to raise their funds. Is that something the European Union is addressing?
I've never thought about the euro under these same time with the introduction of the euro, which by the way is one of the most important steps in European integration, is that at the same time we try to set up regulations, etc., that we prevent evading taxes and illegal transfer of money. I think basically that with the creation of one common monetary market, we make things easier, because until now you had 15 independent national banks. Now you only have one European central bank, and we still have to get our British friends on board, the Danes and the Swedes, but I'm optimistic that soon we have all 15. So I think that basically things, to control things would become easier.
Yes, a question right here.
Hello, I'm Abby Woodward, and I'm just an interested citizen. Mr. Heusgen, you had said that the United States needed to become a party to more conventions, and I would just like to put in my word for the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because we've seen that a lot of fundamentalist groups and terrorist groups are based on not recognizing the human rights of women. So I wanted to add that.
Any other questions or comments? This gentleman in front.
Ed Clemmer, United Nations Association. This morning, there has not been a great deal of discussion about economic factors except for the price of oil. Mr. Ambassador Ransom would even address that question. Who is setting the price? What group is really setting the price of oil now? Is OPEC unified in its actions?
One subject about the Middle East where everybody is always wrong is about the price of oil. So I have no qualms about telling you what my answer is, with the sole proviso that you will accept in advance that it's wrong. The first thing to note about the price of oil is that it's very cheap. If you take oil in terms of the proportion of our economy that it required 15, 20, 30 years ago, it's about half now of what it was. And because of inflation, the real purchasing power of oil revenue to Arab states has dropped precipitously. They have no way to raise it. The second thing is that the price of oil is driven in OPEC to a large extent by the Saudi willingness to keep the price at the lower end of a band. There are lots of others who think it should be higher, but their idea is that with the largest reserves in the world, they want to make sure that over the long run, oil remains competitive. And if the price went up, other countries would develop their oil resources, and people would not turn to the Middle East. So there is a built-in mechanism, it seems to me, interest group, to keep the price of oil low. It does go up and down because, largely, not because there isn't enough oil in the world. There's more than enough oil in the world. If supply and demand were the only criteria, we would not have this run-up of the last several weeks and months in the price of oil. But the problem is that an awful lot of the oil comes out of the Middle East, and supply there can be interrupted by political events. People now buy oil through markets that deal in the future, rather than long-term contracts where the price is fixed. So when they get worried about something happening in the Gulf or in the Middle East, they start bidding up the price of oil for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months from now. So, of the last 8 American recessions, I believe I'm correct in saying 6 have been brought on by sudden spikes in the price of oil that were caused by political interruptions in the Gulf area of supply of oil. This last recession did not. It worked the other way, as I mentioned. And that could be a model for the future increase in the price of oil as well. So, I guess the final answer to your question is that supply and demand basically has a lot to do with the price of oil, but it's driven by anxieties in the global market that push the price from a generally low level up to higher levels repeatedly.
May I use my position being on the podium to ask a question? David, with regard to what you said earlier on the Middle East, I first of all to say that I very much agree with your analysis. Now, if you continue downstream with what you have said, saying that actually we have the elements for a solution on the table, particularly after the Saudi Arabian peace plan being adopted. On the other hand, some of the other plans that we had before, like the Mitchell, the Tenet, etc., they are not workable anymore because there is no functioning Palestinian Authority anymore. There is no police that, even if you could trust them, that it could work. There is no longer anybody there on the Palestinian side. That means if you now come to separation of Palestinian and Israelis, if you want to withdraw the Israelis from the West Bank, there need to be some kind of, in my view, some kind of interposition force. The question is the U.S., is the government administrating as far as you know, is it actively thinking about putting an international force, which basically must be a U.S. force, because that would be the only one probably thinkable that Sharon would accept that. Do you think that the administration is ready to go that far and actually put U.S. soldiers there to guarantee a ceasefire and a peace treaty?
Well, there's very little appetite, it seems to me, in this administration to put American military forces on the ground in the Middle East, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. It's a recipe for frustration. Mr. Powell in the last several days has talked about civilian observers who would be something like the multinational force we now have in Sinai, which has functioned very successfully, but for many years since the 73 war. Well, the key point, though, it seems to me, is that you don't want to put Americans of any type, civilian or military, in between contesting forces. They'll just get shot up and they won't prevent the contest. What you have to do is restore the political discussion and create a political horizon for success. Mr. Netanyahu yesterday in Washington said that he knew how to stop terrorism. For the 3 years he was prime minister, there was no terrorism. And it's true. And that is because for the 3 years that Mr. Netanyahu was prime minister, there was an Oslo process that had presented Palestinians with light, a vision of light at the end of the tunnel. What is going to quell the problem of terrorism in that part of the world and to reduce the type of conflict that now is so bedeviling both sides and curb the hatreds that have been aroused is once again the prospect of a settlement of the sort that we were talking about. That is in many ways a diplomat's dream, I know, but I would say to you, and I would argue very strongly, that the pen really is mightier than the sword. And if you have a political settlement in the offing, you can do a great deal. And if you don't, which is what we have now, neither side trusting the other to deal responsibly and dependably with the other, then you're going to have war. And why put Americans in the middle of that situation? No, there's a way out, and that is for us not to impose, but to take both parties firmly by the elbow and say, settlement based on a Palestinian state. So even in the midst of all this pain and anguish and anger that you see today in Israel, and that is mirrored, I can tell you, it's going to come out with a vengeance when the Israelis do withdraw from some of these cities they have ravaged in the last week. There is still a basis for going ahead with a diplomatic effort, and I hope it succeeds.
I'm tempted to end on the optimistic note of the diplomat's dream, but I think, do we have time for one more question? Just one more. Why don't we take the young man here?
Mike Scarborough with the Heritage Foundation. Just a quick follow-up on that last comment for you, Mr. Ambassador. Can we get such a negotiated settlement with Mr. Arafat representing the Palestinians?
It's going to be hard. We also have to think about Mr. Sharon pretty much in the same light, I'm afraid. It's going to be hard. It's an irony that a man who is an American president, sitting in the White House, pressed with all kinds of advice about what his interests are and the interests of his friends, and given all kinds of roadmaps and abstractions about foreign policy, has to pick up the phone if he wants to get something done and call another man and say, will you do it? And then he has to depend on that man to do it. The personal element in diplomacy is extraordinarily large. Now, the distrust for Mr. Arafat is very deep in Washington, with good reason. It's expressed rather openly. The distrust of Mr. Sharon in Washington is very deep, but not expressed very openly. But you have put your finger on what is the real problem, I think. And somehow, others are going to have to be involved. Now, on the Israeli side, it's quite clear who those people might be. There's a lot of people who have a lot of experience with negotiating these agreements and want to pick up where they left off. On the Palestinian side, in my view, while it is less obvious, there are other people who have had experience in negotiating these agreements and want to pick up where they left off. And what Mr. Powell is going to have to do is somehow steer between Scylla and Charybdis on this one and find a way to get talks going again. Not easy, but not impossible.
Thank you very much. Please join me in recognizing all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion.